Okay, everybody. The first thing we want to do is give you a report from the academic sessions that we just had earlier, which is an important goal of this conference, really, to use this opportunity to feed into Habitat 3 with the research and the outcomes of the evidence that people have gathered up in the academic sessions. So what we're going to do is talk about, each person will give a little bit of a report from each of the sessions, and then we will have a bit of a discussion here, a panel discussion. One of the key goals is to think about where this process goes next. What are the next steps that we are going to take as conference attendees and as participants to be able to be part of this? So I'm just going to make a few introductory remarks. As I've said before, it seems to me that this conference series is circling around a very important idea at its core. It's a recognition of the powerful inherent dynamics of cities as engines of human development, and the central role of public space in generating that dynamic, as recent research is demonstrating, and the research in our academic sessions. It seems that through this dynamic, cities can greatly enhance the capacity and the capability of their residents, all residents, under the right conditions, to secure and to enrich their quality of life, both individually and in common. And cities have the remarkable ability to do that with a great kind of metabolic efficiency, reducing the consumption of resources, ecosystem degradation, and emissions per capita. And this is the very hopeful message that the new research is showing us, and that I think you'll hear a little bit more about from our session moderators. But if we are going to harness this beneficial dynamic, there are very specific structural requirements that we must meet, requirements that exist down to the level of streets and sidewalks and other human-scale public places, and the networks of private and semi-private places that adjoin them. It seems that this engine of human capacity and human development, this capability of cities, relies upon the connected characteristics of its public space networks, its place networks, if you will, to function efficiently and without an insatiable and unsustainable level of resource consumption. A closely related point is that this engine relies on a capacity for self-organization, for adapting the structure of the city to human needs and to creative development. This means that there is indeed a bottom-up aspect of cities that must be recognized and empowered, as Richard Sinnott and Saskia and others have talked about. But this is not an argument of bottom-up versus top-down. Rather, it's a question of how top-down can facilitate bottom-up and vice versa. It's a question of how to create linkages between top-down and bottom-up. And yes, as an active aspect of complex adaptive systems, as you heard earlier today. But unfortunately, this message about cities and their public space frameworks is slow to make it into our urban operating systems today, even though much of this work goes back to the middle of the last century, and you're all familiar with work by people like Jane Jacobs and William H. White, keen observers of the urban environment and the elements that make it work. Instead, what we have today is still heavily dominated by top-down, supply-side, mechanical models of cities that require enormous injections of depleting resources. And then they do produce short-term wealth, enormous short-term wealth. And so this is an irresistible appeal. But if you like, it is the crack cocaine of urban development today. It leaves us with very terrible side effects. And so we have to get a handle on this problem. And public space is increasingly a casualty in this formulation. Where public space exists at all, it's in tokenistic dollops and artistically composed master creations of heroic designers. And quite simply, this approach is failing us. And this comes at a time, as I think everyone in this room knows, when the globe is urbanizing at an unprecedented pace, when we are poised to create more urban fabric in the next 50 years than we have in all of human history heretofore. Think about that. And when we also face unprecedented threats from resource depletion and climate change and systems collapse. Cities can be enormous contributors to the problems that we face, to the potential catastrophes we face, but they can also be powerful contributors to the solutions. So we hope that Habitat 3 and its aftermath will provide the opportunity for a genuine new urban agenda, quote unquote, not just a list of boxes ticked or fine-sounding sentiments and aspirations, but really a pragmatic understanding of the actions needed, the concrete steps that we need to take, informed by evidence, the knowledge that's going to be needed to inform those actions. We need a new urban agenda, if you like, for knowledge into action. So in that light, my hardworking colleagues who moderated the 8 academic sessions are all going to join us briefly and make an overview of each of the sessions and their conclusions. And these sessions comprise a remarkable body of 34 papers that were presented orally, spanning a wide variety of topics of public space and placemaking, but with a focus on the, as I said, the concrete actions for the future on research into practice. So the academic sessions were divided into 8 complementary topics, each covering a subject area of UN agency involvement as that work relates to the public space agenda. Each session also included a UN agency participant who could speak to the UN agency work in each of these areas so that we could ask how work on these topics might plug into their work through Habitat 3 and beyond. And each presenter, including the UN people and the academic presenters, was asked to express through their moderator the key conclusions and agenda issues that, as the attendees saw it, should be agenda items for this wider conference and for Habitat 3 and beyond. And speaking for my colleagues, I think we can say that we found clear evidence of the critical role of public space and also many hopeful tools and resources to take this knowledge forward into action. We've only touched the surface here, but we hope that this is going to begin the process of bringing this knowledge together and moving forward. So we want to gather this information up, not only in these sessions, but in the follow-up work, use it as concrete output for the conference toward a new urban agenda. And it seems that this is really a key goal of the conference, as I said before, to move beyond aspirations, as nice as those are. It's time for a concrete antidote to the failing models that we are dealing with today. If we're going to meet the challenges of the future, we must, I think, employ a pragmatic, shareable, evidence-based approach to making successful public places for human beings. Now I'd like to start with my colleague Joanna Alamanestianu, who talked about the role of gender and inclusive cities. Are they on? Test, test. Okay.
Hello. I had the honor of moderating 5 different speakers. And I will try to conclude on what we came up with. Angela spoke on Safer Cities methodology, public space as the medium. Annie, designing public places based on use, the examples of Perth and Poon. Joanna talked about an integrative methodology for the quality of life measurement in urban places based on the accomplishment of urban need, of human need. I'm really sorry. Jasdeep spoke of public space, the conduit for realizing human rights in cities for all. And Marcus spoke about using a game, a computer game, Minecraft, as a citizen participation tool in urban design and decision-making. We came up with some conclusions that I'd like to share with you. Develop a standard procedure to measure quality of daily life, not just of life, not just of statistics, but the quality of daily life before designing is undertaken. Apply lessons from existing successful places. We have to look at what people love as we move forward to learn from those places, without regard to stylistic fashions or novelties. Use communication technologies to promote safety and mobility for all people. So let's look at the technologies that we have, the innovations that we have, and use those to create safer places. Provide evidence available from research for the economic and quality of life benefits of public space for all. So those evidences, we need to even scientifically show the public and the professionals that public space is important for the well-being of people. Use educational institutes and media to raise awareness and responsibility for the importance of public space for all and the right to its access for all. I want to add to this that during this session, but also, I'm sorry, I have to try to read this here. During this session, but honestly, it comes up all the time, that clients, designers, and even the residents of places have been, for decades, striving for novelty and even stardom in many cases. So it's novelty they're striving for. They're not putting their work, they're not putting people at the premise of their work. They're not designing for people. They're looking for what is new and different at all costs. It seems to me, and to many of my colleagues, that it's time for a Hippocratic oath for the built environment, an oath that planners and architects would take. It is time that we as professionals do no harm. And I must say, many planners and architects out there are doing harm. And people should create wonderful places that can be loved and that people will want to care for. If they're not loved, they won't be cared for. And they'll become more wonderful over time. It becomes evident that sustainability is not enough. We can't sustain what we just have. We have to be designing and striving for resilience. Places have to become better with time. And the only way that we can get that is to create places that people are going to love and feel they belong. Thank you.
Hi. I was working with the Urban Form group. Yeah. Okay. Well, these were the good folk who did a lot of the work and the presentations. There was considerable overlap, and so I commend the papers to you. I won't go through them all by title, but I'm very grateful to the people who did put on all that work and contributed. I'll try and get to the key conclusions. I've tried to summarize, and I apologize if I've not done it, because there's so much to try and summarize on urban form, for heaven's sake, you know. But the built environment is a political system in its own right, and that's something that we have to really, I think, fully understand and recognize. And like any other political system, because depending on how it's configured, it allows certain people to do certain things and makes it very difficult for other people to do other things, and therefore, by definition, it's political. right? Before it's aesthetic, before it's anything else, it is political, with a small p. And we fail to recognize that a lot of the time, and that's why we end up just playing around with shape and form and uniqueness and novelty and all sorts of rubbish, because we don't acknowledge that it's a political system. We think it's an aesthetic one. And realize that the urban configuration, therefore, of streets, squares, and parks affects social life. So why do we build? Why do we go through all this? We build to facilitate exchange in all its forms. Information, friendship, material goods, culture, knowledge, spiritual support. And therefore, if that's why we bother as an interactive species to get together in the first place, then we have to build urbanism so that we can maximize the exchange while minimizing the travel necessary to do it. Otherwise, the city is not doing what we built cities for in the first place. So that's pretty fundamental in urban form terms. So maybe, therefore, urban design could be, it's defined in many, many ways, isn't it? But it could be as the activity of designing achievable environments to support the interests of the widest publics who use them. So, one thing that was very consistent in a lot of these bits of research that were being done in separate places and separate institutions was the whole issue of understanding those previous points and designing cities where the integration and connectivity was fundamental and prefaced to nearly all the other decisions that follow from it. And so, if you like, a city is an assemblage of, quoting Bill Hillier, or paraphrasing Bill Hillier in space syntax, I suppose, a city is an assemblage of parts into wholes, rather than wholes in which good parts arise. And a city is represented in the structure of space. And at this level, it's amazing. A lot of people struggle with this, and it's a lot to debate, but cities are remarkably similar by the fact that they're cities. They are very, very similar. They have a lot of subtle cultural differences that overlay them and enrich them and make them extraordinarily unique. But at a fundamental level, they are perhaps more similar in their structure than we actually believe and give them credit for being. Because in the end, even though our differences are remarkable and subtle, and long may they continue to be so, distinctive in every sense, we are still perhaps more similar than we might think sometimes as human beings and what we need, because we're all interactive species. So connectivity and spatial integration is fundamental to this aim, and I think there's one thing that was pretty consistent through all the different interpretations of methodologies and approaches, was that the two-dimensional fundamental connectivity and structure gives logic to the three-dimensional form and the fourth dimension of time. You know, it goes that way, it works that way. And an urban form, I think it's fair, and I hope I'm representing in summary, needs to return to the organized complexity of that fabulous term that Jane Jacobs coined many years ago. It's not chaos, it's organized complexity. And therefore that's the thing to celebrate. But it happens at the macro, the meso, and the micro levels, which is the point I think Michael was making earlier. And so we have to get back to that natural way in which we built relationship between building entrance and public space, between inhabitants and strangers, and between local and global movement. And I think a lot of nearly all the papers that were presented were addressing fundamentally those things in their own special way. And very interesting from one of the presenters. Again, the whole business of defining what a city is, we all try to do it, don't we? But in order to be a city, you have to be able to see people, or perhaps to be in a city, maybe should I say. You have to be able to see people, know nothing about most of them, and spot potential destinations. And that's what makes it a city. It's the community of strangers that makes it remarkable. It comes and goes. It's the macro, the meso, and the micro. But what do we do with all of this? I think that one of the things that we talked about in our group, with the fabulous contribution of the audience, was this whole thing about how do you turn all of this into some kind of operating system when the scale of these things is going to happen, as was said earlier, at such a pace, at such a scale, it's almost incomprehensible. at one level. But bureaucracies will never disappear, and we have to shape the shapers. I think one of the things that is perhaps consistent to all of us here is a belief that we have a lot of shapers, but they all talk to each other, and we've lost the ability to shape the shapers. And one thing that we've got to do in this group as best we can is actually shape the shapers. But it's essential, I think, that the risk-averse shapers of the city have to be given new rules and form-based codes that give them certainty. We can't just plead. You know, I think we have to turn these things into operating systems. And the thing that was very interesting about a lot of the research that was done was it got towards an operating system, but the whole idea of how if we want people to change, a lot of people who are risk-averse will not change unless a lot of that risk is covered and taken and shared. And I think that's really crucial. So the whole issue of how in urban form we try to address the increasingly risk-averse shapers of the city, either because of financial constraints, financial constrictions, or because of an increasingly litigious world. We are not going to be able to get the organized complexity back into the place. So we have to use both form-based rules, but also that give people certainty and confidence that they can change what they do. Thank you very much.
I love that phrase, change the operating system. I think we as a conference are going to have to think about that. What are the specifics? And Paul's group didn't get into a lot of those, but he mentioned coding and changes to laws and so on. There are a lot of those things that we can get into more deeply. Harrison?
So here's the list of our co-conspirators. And I'll start with the UN expert. We had quite a diversity of papers in this group. And Stefanos made a wonderful point that we really have a job to try to decouple the economic growth and well-being of cities from their environmental impact. And he made the point that we have to do this by providing infrastructure that's much more efficient, resource efficient, and that we can use the public space of cities to help in this process. Robert Adam was very pithy about the fact that space is not a virtue by itself. It has to do with the quality of how it's designed. Janet gave a great talk about emergent placemaking, and she talked about how citizens and people can collaborate with nature to provide all sorts of wonderful eco-services, as well as food, as well as a social capital and networking and collaboration with the city. Richard Hall described himself as a recovering traffic engineer and gave us a little lesson about walkable streets and how important they are to the environmental performance of public space, and how dominant still cars are in our cities. Yodan Rofe was very eloquent about the fact that open space standards, especially quantity standards, can actually destroy urbanism. That you can require too much space, which means you have space and not urbanism. We had a wonderful discussion, and I will just quickly summarize it in two ways. First of all, the audience and the members of the group seem to think that environmental performance is underrepresented and underdeveloped in our statement so far. And the wonderful innovation and lessons from the Global South and all of the informal settlements is also underrepresented and underdeveloped here. What I tried to do was give the following summary of, guess what? This was supposed to not be here. So let's do the next one. Okay. So first of all, I think there was general agreement that designing the public space of cities to be a place of environmental performance is underdeveloped, is an underdeveloped resource and underdeveloped here. And we use performance because the public space is not an object. It enables things. And we happen to be talking about the environment, but it enables social performance, economic performance, mobility performance, safety performance. It is a place of performance. It can deliver a full range of eco-services as part of an integrated whole system design of infrastructure, which was Stefanos' position. And it really needs to include issues of how we provide energy, water, waste, food, and the transit systems. Going back to Doug and my presentation, it can really temper the microclimate. It can absorb carbon, filter air pollution, treat and reuse stormwater, treat and reuse wastewater, grow food, provide habitat and refuge for species, grow biomass for energy. But most of all, it can be a place of sensory delight. In other words, it can be a place of desire. And thus, it has a positive impact on our health and well-being. It can be a key to combating and tempering the causes and impacts of climate change, especially the health threats from heat waves and the heat island effect. We talked about that yesterday. The group agreed it's not about quantity, but quality. And it's highly dependent on the specifics of the context. So it has to do with each individual street or block or neighborhood. And it's not just about the parks and plazas or the pocket parks. It has to engage the city's network of streets, as they represent as much as 40% of the city's land use. This has to be the space of environmental performance. Most importantly, and this is, I think everybody agreed with this, and it can become a source of economic development, a catalyst for social interaction and performance. We've heard that many times so far. And it really is a means for local citizen and government cooperation. In fact, it has to be done that way. It has to have both. And thus, it's in vital importance to the quality and livelihood of local people's everyday lives, especially the most marginal and vulnerable. Thank you.
So for the next presentation on children, Joyati Das will speak for that group.
Thank you. I think we're coming to the end of the day, so I can see many tired faces. But it is about children and youth and full of energy. So we had a dynamic and very interesting discussion around children and youth participation in the city. And I won't go through all the names here, but panel members represented UN Habitat, grassroots and international NGOs, academic institutes like Stanford University, and we were presenting evidence of genuine participation of children and youth in making cities a livable space. As panel members, we presented case studies from diverse cities across the world, ranging from Nairobi informal settlements and children's view of these fragile pockets of the cities, Latin American cities, Asian cities like Dhaka, and also complex cities like Beirut. The topics that we covered were children as knowledge gatherers. And that was kind of coming common across all presenters, was that children are actually knowledge gatherers. They are experts in the knowledge about their local community and their space, the space they live in. They are the information providers, information collectors. They are so comfortable, which I'm not, with technology, with mapping. We also heard of many case studies talking about youth and children mapping their space in this informal settlements, social reporting. We heard many examples of children claiming space in the city. We had academics talk about tools that they are designing that are using the 5 senses to support communities to understand and map formal and informal public spaces, mapping positive and negative public space. And children are, one of the most important things, as a mother I can tell you, the most important, most difficult thing is that how truthful and honest they are. Very difficult to deal with. But as an agency, of World Vision International, that's where I work, we are about children, and I think the last presenter was talking about especially the most vulnerable. And they are the most vulnerable in the city. And I'll tell you why, because traditionally, the voices of children and youth have been non-existent. So the new urban agenda, we need to put their voices central to the conversations because they are going to be the future citizens of the city. So we talked about where discussions were to, how do we ensure there is all this conversation, and as an NGO and others talked about genuine participation. We get them all excited. They are the creators of new thinking and innovation. But how do we then ensure that their ideas and the truth-telling that they're doing, how do we ensure that that is impacting and influencing the city decision makers, the policy makers? And that is something that we absolutely have to consider, because we need to ensure that we are making politicians accountable to the future citizens of the city. What did we discuss? The key conclusions? Very quickly, I would say the recommendations were: 1, as I talked about, knowledge. Children and youth are experts of their local communities and public space that they live in. This group should be considered the knowledge bearers to enhance city knowledge. Cities are dynamic, ever-changing. Data is an issue that we all know. But children and youth can bring that knowledge and data to city planning and policy making. Secondly, we said participation to influence policy. As I said just now, children and youth are using technology. They are the experts in the trade. And we need to ensure that they become a resource to manage, influence, transformation, and change within their communities and influencing policy and decision makers. The third one we talked about is ownership. We have to ensure and consider children and youth as active participants in the management, maintenance, and delivery of public space. They are in the schools. Let them be, owning that public space, which is school. The soccer stadiums and the soccer places and the space that they play. Can we not have children and youth become owners of that management and delivery of quality of space alongside with municipal governments? And our call for action really was that cities must include safe, playful, accessible spaces for children and youth to ensure that the future citizens of the city grow up in a positive environment. Otherwise, we will never be able to achieve livable cities. Thank you.
Thank you, Jayati. Chuck Bull will speak on the economics and economy section.
Okay, we had 4 of our papers that were submitted presented by people in person. There were another 2 that were quite relevant. All of the papers actually brought, and all of the presenters brought something unique and directly engaged in the topic, but different perspectives for the overall theme of economy. And I'm not going to go through each and every one, but you can see just from the titles that we're bringing in different perspectives on the regulation of public spaces and other perspectives. And here are the others. We also had a video that was shown, and Michael, maybe you can remind me who created the video. It was the labor group? ILO, which was also short. It fit into the schedule and time frame and brought some additional perspectives on the nature of labor and work in relation to public space. So that was actually quite useful. So key messages. First, public space consists of a wide. We did talk about the nature of public space itself because that continues to be an amorphous term. So public space consists of a wide variety of streets, parks, plazas, and other places of public use that collectively represent the public realm of cities. It's important that we continue to distinguish, as Richard Sennett pointed out this morning, place from this more a squishy notion of space. Secondly, that streets and public spaces have served essential economic functions of cities as long as cities have existed. This is nothing new, but the public realm is essential to the economic sustainability of communities. So going forward, the public realm is an essential part of sustainability. Well-designed streets and public spaces are pedestrian-oriented, and this is where, the video was interesting because one of the examples given in the video was that streets can be important because they can convey people from their homes to their workplaces, which is a very kind of conventional notion of streets as very utilitarian and the movement of cars. And I think that caused some pause, and so the collective audience brought up the importance of pedestrian orientation of streets and public spaces. So, certainly the public spaces and streets can accommodate and connect all modes of transport, but they are pedestrian focused to perform an economic function. Pedestrian-oriented streets and spaces generate substantial public value. This is, the next 2 are very much in agreement with 2 points in one of the issue papers we were given, issue paper 11, I think it was. Widespread agreement on this. Pedestrian-oriented streets and public spaces are drivers of economic development and should be planned to support both formal and especially informal activities. Street vendors, recyclers, service providers, the informal sector, there's a huge population that this is the only place for economic activity to take place, in streets and public spaces. And rather than work against the economic activity in the public realm, we felt that we should be planning for these activities to take place and to manage it. It obviously also creates conflicts. Not all public spaces are appropriate for economic activity, so it requires forethought and management. Next one, need to commit more resources and consider hybrid public-private nonprofit models for the software, for the management and maintenance of public space and activities supported. One comment was, a huge amount of the resources put into public spaces has to do with the physical environment, has to do with the physical design and the stuff of public spaces, and very little on management and maintenance. So there needs to be a lot more balance and resources put into this, especially when we're talking about spaces that are used for economic activity. On the research topic, so these are all related to the other thing we were asked to think about research. There is considerable existing research on the positive impact of public space on things like property values. And there's some examples there, and that funny quote that, if you really wanted to value Central Park, it's estimated at $528 billion by a property appraisal firm. That's a funny way of pointing out that it's not just about the economic value that's created. Property taxes are one method of trying to capture some of the value created by public space. It's an imperfect one, and different administrations do better at putting that value that's collected back into things that are of social utility and back into public space. But we felt very strongly that there's a bigger picture to this value proposition. Beyond property taxes and economic exchange, research should measure the broader value of public space for society and help quantify the positive impacts on health, mobility, environmental quality, social cohesion, place attachment, all of these other things that contribute to the economic health of cities. And there was a feeling, and I saw a lot of nodding around the room, that when I talked about, while this was useful, very useful for us to break up into these different topics, it's all connected, it's all integrated, each of these topics that we're summarizing here. There was a particular paper that talked about tapping the power of the internet and social media to evaluate public spaces, similar to how these tools, WalkScore and TripAdvisor, evaluate places and all kinds of other things, and correlate those with the other performance measures. So walk scores are now used by this big real estate data company to assess real estate value. Before we say not everybody has access to technology and social media, there is the whole wisdom of crowds aspect of this, that the more real-time, real people that we can have evaluating and assessing how effective these places are, the better information we have. Just like there's a wisdom to this crowd, because not any one of us have all the answers and perspectives here. And then lastly, create intergenerational balance sheets for evaluating the value, investment, management, and performance of public space. So value to old, young, and future generations. So it's not just a one point in time, but public space is a long-term investment, and we should evaluate it as such. And I think that's it. Oh, it's an example. Those are repeats. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Chuck. And Ethan, Kent has covered the security session.
So I'll try to be quick. So a couple quick points from the from sort of the background that the people that analyzed Johannesburg talked about. Surveys showed that safety is actually and security is the #2 priority of people in the city after having a job. And people there's a lot of surveying of issues about young women, of adolescent girls, and there's safety issues that are coming into to be understood a lot better. Looking at areas in Delhi, only 3.3% of girls said they feel safe on transit. 2.2% feel safe walking around Lima. These are huge challenges that are certainly limiting their experience of public space and their city fundamentally. So we had a really wonderful, diverse group of perspectives and in context with which we looked at these different issues, from Johannesburg to Kampala to Hanoi, to both rural and urban context, applying the shared spaces of rural communities and the lessons there that can be applied to urban communities. And this is, Ed Wall looked at London and sort of design-led top-down interventions and how they affected people's experience of public space. But the key conclusions and sort of ideas that came out were, if you're looking at public space, you have to always look at safety. It's an underlying fundamental issue in our experience of public space. But it's not, this group is called security, but people really wanted to emphasize that it's a broader feeling of safety that is important. Safety is not just about policing and security. But to address safety and security fundamentally requires an integrated approach to public space, was sort of the overall theme, I think, of all the presentations. That it's integrating the different, often silos of government and also of the pillars of development that UN Habitat's put forward, of integrating policy, planning, design, management, together. The legislation, the policy also needs to be, it's not just about policies, but about developing governance, about community capacity as well. There's a big emphasis on looking at short-term uses, on use program events are essential. The temporary elements can make a big impact, and are just designing a space alone doesn't make it work. And that playing design needs to be integrated with security and maintenance and programming. So again, it's no one of those is going to make them work together. They leverage each other. It's just a simple proclamation that safe, clean, well-maintained public space is an essential component of healthy neighborhoods. And then at the end, someone pointed out that there's been a lot of discussion about securitizing public spaces, with some of the bigger issues of fear of terrorism and so forth. But some of these efforts are not necessarily making our public spaces safer. And then there was a couple last big points that were made, basically these conclusions are very similar to, I think, the broader conclusions of the conference, and our sort of work with UN Habitat actually first started through the Safer Cities program, and our work in the 70s and 80s in the US was really entering through this discussion. But the lessons I think we've all learned are really to fundamentally address these safety and security issues, are to take a proactive approach to shaping public spaces, making them places, making them owned by their community. The approach is, to create a place, you need a community, and you need a community to create a place. So it's this iterative approach, the building of governance, the process through which these places are shaped are central to addressing these safety and security issues. And one of the speakers said that the role of the profession in this century is to facilitate and empower 1 billion slum dwellers to self-build their communities. So no longer just to be sensitive to communities and responsive to these issues, but to build their capacity to make change themselves, to shape their communities themselves. So I'll end there.
Thank you very much, Ethan. Tigran will give the presentation on heritage. You know how to do that. There's the microphone.
60 seconds, because I know you have to run to the boats. Before I do that, 47 times today I've been asked, where is Michael Mahaffey? Who's Michael Mahaffey? And this reminded me, I was reminded, actually, Michael Mahaffey has done a tremendous job in these scientific sessions, so please give a warm hand of applause to him. Thank you. I don't think any of us would be here if it wasn't for Michael. So good. In our session, I hope I do justice to the papers, we felt warmth, we felt love, we felt spirituality, we felt everything. So it was all about good placemaking. It's all about good places. And I'll try to summarize it very fast, not going into the details. The element of spirituality combined with physicality and also sociability came up. The importance, how do you sort of expand specific places, in spiritual places like in Kathmandu or in Saudi Arabia and Medina, but not sort of encroaching on the qualities of the place and also on the heritage. Show that sort of the public places are indestructible elements that change through time. And they're also, as Richard Sennett has said, kind of an open system where each generation has a possibility to build upon the previous one. We also discussed the importance of how to tame the automobile in heritage or heritage places in historic towns. What simple elements of sort of simple elements of urbanism can do major things. Signages and things like that, changes in the pavement can actually manage the historical towns in a great way. We also discussed the importance of looking at the city from a human city or I-city level. There was a great book on plinths that recently came out. Also, the idea was that we look at the importance of the encroachment of tourists, for me, one of the worst species that exists, on the historical centers. How can we balance the tourist industry with the people that have been there for hundreds of years in different families that have lived in historical centers? So it's hardware, it's software, it's the importance of public space, it's the importance of historical patterns that carries on. But really this session was a wonderful one, fantastic 4 papers, 2 were not present there, and an excellent contribution from the audience. So I'm saving time now. I'm done.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Tigran. Thank you for your kind words. But I want to, after I finish very briefly with the health session, I want to thank all the chairs and the people who've been part of this. It's been quite a complicated affair. So we had a number of great presentations in the health section. One of the key goals there was to try to tie, as I said before, evidence into practice, knowledge into practice, and I think that's something we all have to do as we go forward, thinking about that. Again, I won't go through all of the people by name, but you do have those papers in your thumb drive and online, and I would really encourage you to examine those and get in touch with people who are doing work that's of interest to you. We had really just 4 major conclusions. One was to develop a common evidence framework, bridging the silos, silo busters. Fred Kent is talking about starting a new organization called the Silo Busters. I like that idea. And looking at the impact of public space on health. Identify the economic impacts, as Chuck was saying earlier, and identify the funders who are going to be motivated by those economic impacts to drive policy changes and that are going to have the levers to change that operating system, as Paul Moraine said. Develop a new evidence-based assessment model for planning public space. Let's not keep making the same mistakes over and over again. Let's start to use an evidence-based approach and learn from history. Raise awareness of health impacts from public space design, and use a dynamic approach to public space, and of course place making involving the residents and other local agents, because again, one size does not fit all. So please, before we get on the boat, join me in thanking all the chairs and all the participants who contributed papers. Thank you very much.